The night sky over Earth was peaceful, too peaceful, but in the vast expanse of the stars, a silent shadow moved, tearing through the atmosphere like a comet. The spacecraft's engines roared, flames licking at the hull as it plummeted toward Earth at a terrifying speed. Inside the cockpit, a young alien girl, her features sharp and beautiful, was gripping the control panel with white knuckles. Her skin glowed faintly under the lights, her violet eyes wide with fear. The craft was losing power fast, and alarms screamed in warning. Her ship was designed for space travel, for exploration across the stars, but nothing could prepare it for the violent turbulence she was now experiencing. Her heart raced. The crew of her ship was dead, casualties from an ambush by a faction of alien raiders. She had barely escaped, just her and a handful of survivors. But now she was alone, drifting into a hostile world she'd never known. Systems failing. Emergency protocol activated. The voice of the ship's AI crackled out of the speakers, but there was no comfort in it. The ship's shields were down, and its energy reserves were nearly drained. The alien girl slammed her fist against the control panel, trying desperately to maintain control, but it was useless. The ground was coming up too fast. A sudden, violent shake rattled the craft. The girl's body was thrown forward, and her vision blurred as the craft lurched. There was no time to react. A fiery explosion ripped through the engines, and everything went dark. When the girl woke up, she was lying in the middle of a shattered landscape, her body aching, her head throbbing as if it might explode. Her violet eyes slowly opened, squinting against the bright sunlight. Her vision was blurry at first, but she blinked, trying to focus. Her ship, or what was left of it, was in ruins. The once pristine hull was now scattered in jagged pieces around her, like debris from a terrible storm. She sat up with a wince, the pain from her broken body flaring as she moved. Her breathing was heavy and labored. She had never felt pain like this before. It was unlike anything her people had ever known. They were known for their strength, their advanced biology, their ability to heal from injuries quickly. But this was different. This was serious. Her hands trembled as she touched her side. The deep gash was still bleeding, a strange red liquid oozing from the wound. Her alien physiology was powerful, but even it had limits, and she had pushed herself too far. Her ship had crashed in a completely foreign environment, one that was unknown and hostile to her kind. There was no telling what dangers lurked in this new world, but she was alive. Somehow she had survived the crash. She couldn't die here. Not like this. She had to fight. She tried to stand, but the pain in her side stopped her. She gritted her teeth, refusing to let the weakness overcome her. Her mind raced through survival instincts, but the world around her was overwhelming. The trees here were unlike anything she had seen on her home planet. The air smelled different. The ground felt strange beneath her feet. She was so far from her home, and yet she had to survive. It was then that she heard it, the crunch of footsteps on the dry earth. The girl froze, her senses alert. Someone was coming. Fear struck her heart. Had the raiders followed her? Were they coming to finish the job? Her breath quickened. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, and she instinctively backed away into the wreckage of her ship, using the remains for cover. Her violet eyes darted around, trying to find an escape route. The pain in her side flared as she tried to move, but she couldn't just lie there and wait for whoever was approaching. She reached out with her mind, attempting to tap into her advanced alien abilities. But something was wrong. Her connection to her powers was unstable. The crash had damaged more than just the ship, it had hurt her too. She couldn't rely on her powers to escape this situation. She would have to use her wits and her skills, just like any other survivor. The footsteps drew closer and the girl held her breath. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She had been trained for combat, trained to fight, but this was different. She was weak, she was injured, and she had no idea who or what was out there. Then, out of the shadows, a figure appeared. A human. The girl's mind was swirling. Medic? What did that mean? She had heard that humans could heal their own kind, but that was no guarantee that she could be saved. She wasn't one of them. She was an alien from a different world entirely. The chances of her surviving in a strange place like this, without her ship, without her powers, seemed slim. But something in her gut told her this human wasn't going to harm her. There was something honest in the way he spoke. It didn't make sense, but she had no time to argue. The pain was getting worse, and her vision blurred. She had to make a choice, and she knew it wasn't going to be easy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. Her voice was weak, hoarse, and cracked, but she managed to get the words out. Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." The medic's face softened. He stepped a little closer, his eyes scanning her injuries, but not in a way that felt invasive. It was almost as if he was looking for the right moment to help her without overwhelming her. "I don't need to know you," he said quietly. "All I know is that you're hurt, and I can help. I may not know where you came from, or what happened to your ship, but I'm not leaving until I make sure you're okay." She felt a strange warmth fill her chest. No one had ever said something like that to her. Her own people were known for their strength, their power, but the humans, they were supposed to be weak, primitive. Yet here was one of them, offering help without expecting anything in return. This human wasn't like the others. He didn't look at her like an enemy. He didn't fear her. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jack," he replied with a small, reassuring smile. "Jack Rivers. What about you?" She hesitated for a moment, then spoke her name, though it felt strange to give it to someone she didn't even know. But then again, the situation was strange. Nothing made sense anymore. "I am." She stopped herself. "I am Elira." The medic, Jack, nodded slowly, repeating her name to himself, as though he wanted to remember it. He didn't look shocked by her alien appearance, though she knew she must look strange to him. Her skin was smooth and glowing faintly, her violet eyes unnaturally bright. Her features were sharp, not like a human's, and she had strange markings on her arms, tattoos of sorts, that glowed slightly when she moved. "I can't keep standing like this," Elira said, wincing as pain shot through her side. She slowly lowered herself back to the ground, leaning against the twisted wreckage of her ship for support. Jack didn't hesitate. He immediately knelt beside her, pulling a small metallic device from his bag. It was unfamiliar to her, but he moved with confidence, as though he had used it many times before. "This will help you," Jack explained softly, as he gently placed the device against her wound. The machine hummed to life, and Elira felt a strange sensation, a cooling effect against her burning skin. She gasped, her eyes wide in surprise. It wasn't like any technology she had seen before. The human was using some sort of healing technology, something far beyond her understanding, but it worked. Jack didn't say anything more as he focused on treating her wound. His hands moved quickly but carefully, and she couldn't help but admire his skill. He was methodical, precise, everything she hadn't expected from a human. The pain in her side slowly faded, replaced by a warm, soothing sensation. She watched him, intrigued, but still unsure what to make of this man, this medic who had shown up out of nowhere to save her. "Why are you out here?" she asked, her voice still soft but stronger now that the pain was beginning to subside. "What's a medic like you doing in a place like this?" Jack paused, glancing at her for a moment before he answered. "I work for a rescue team. We're trained to handle situations like this, search and rescue missions, especially for emergencies like crashes, disasters, anything that needs help." He looked around, as if assessing the wreckage. "It's not every day we find a ship from another planet, but if someone's in trouble, I'm here to help." The Lyra's mind raced. A rescue team. He wasn't alone then. There could be more humans nearby, more people she'd have to deal with. But there was something about Jack that made her feel less afraid. Perhaps it was because he didn't seem afraid of her. "That's what you do for a living?" she asked. "You help others." Jack nodded. "That's right. I've seen a lot in my career, but I never imagined I'd be treating an alien." He gave her a soft smile. "You're not what I expected, but you don't seem so different from anyone else who needs help." Elira looked at him, her mind still struggling to process everything. There was kindness in his words, in his actions. It was so different from what she had encountered before, especially in the aftermath of her crash. Back on her home world, they had taught her that compassion and kindness were weaknesses. But here, in this strange place, this human was showing her the kind of warmth and care that no one ever had. And for the first time since the crash, she felt a flicker of hope. The machine finished its work, and Jack gently removed it from her side. The wound was healing rapidly, far faster than it had before, though she could still feel some residual pain. But now it was bearable. She could breathe easier. "There," Jack said, standing up and offering her a hand. "How do you feel?" Elira hesitated for a moment, looking at his outstretched hand. She was still weak, still shaken by the crash and the pain, but something about this human's presence made her want to trust him. She took his hand. "Better," she whispered, looking up at him. "Much better. Thank you." Jack smiled. "I told you I'd help. Now we need to figure out how to get you out of here." Elira nodded, finally allowing herself to relax, though only slightly. She was still in a dangerous situation. The raiders were out there, and her ship was beyond repair. But for the first time since the crash, she didn't feel entirely alone. Jack might not be her people, but right now, he was all she had. The silence between Elira and Jack was thick with the weight of unspoken questions. They sat there, only a few feet apart, the tension of their strange encounter still hanging in the air. Despite the fact that Jack had healed her injuries and her body was slowly recovering, her mind was still racing with 1,000 thoughts. She couldn't remember how long she had been unconscious. She couldn't even remember how her ship had crashed, only that everything had happened too fast, too violently. Now here she was, on a foreign world, helped by a human. And for the first time since the crash, Elira felt something she hadn't in years: hope. Jack had moved to give her space after the treatment. He was standing near the wreckage, looking at something on his small tablet-like device. He seemed calm, collected, like this wasn't his first time handling a situation like this. Elira was amazed. He had been so steady when he had approached her, so confident in what he was doing. Finally, Elira spoke, her voice still hoarse from the dehydration and exhaustion. "What happens now?" Jack turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers. The look on his face was kind, but it carried a sense of determination. "Now we figure out what to do next. First, you need rest. You've been through a lot. The worst part's over. I've stabilized your wound, but your body will need time to recover." Elira shifted uncomfortably, still feeling the unfamiliar weight of her body's pain. It wasn't just the injury, it was everything. Her mind felt disconnected from her physical self, as if she wasn't entirely sure she was still in control. But as she looked at Jack, something inside her shifted. She felt safe. It was strange, almost impossible to believe, but the warmth in her chest grew stronger with each passing second. She couldn't explain it, but she knew that Jack was here to help her. "Thank you for saving me," she said quietly, unsure of how to express the gratitude she felt. She had never known a being like him before, and yet here he was, putting aside everything he knew to help someone he had never met. Jack's eyes softened, and he gave a small, understanding nod. "You don't need to thank me," he replied, his voice gentle. "It's what I do. It's my job. People, aliens, humans, anyone who needs help, if I can do something, I'll do it." Elira looked down at her hands, trembling slightly as she processed his words. A human who truly cared about others, no matter who they were, no matter where they came from. It seemed almost impossible. Her people had been raised on the idea of survival at all costs, to trust no one, to be wary of anyone who wasn't part of their species. And yet here was Jack, a human, showing her the kind of kindness she had never been shown before. "I don't understand," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you help someone like me? An alien, a stranger." Jack took a deep breath, turning his body to face her fully. There was a moment of hesitation before he answered. "Because," he started slowly, "I don't see you as a stranger. You're a person, a life. I don't care where you're from or what you look like. If you're hurt, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you get better." Elira's heart beat a little faster at his words, a wave of warmth spreading through her chest. She had never felt anything like this before. She was a soldier, a fighter, someone who was always prepared for the worst. But in Jack's presence, there was no need to be on guard. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that Elira couldn't ignore. They made her believe in something she had forgotten. Trust. "Back on my world," Elira said, "we're taught to rely on ourselves. We don't trust others easily. I didn't expect to trust you. I didn't think I could. But," she hesitated, her voice trailing off. "But I do. I think I do." Jack smiled, and there was a hint of pride in his expression. "Trust is a powerful thing," he said, sitting down on a nearby rock, his body language relaxed. "It's not easy to give, and it's even harder to earn. But it's worth it." Elira nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. She had never realized how important trust could be. It wasn't something she had ever valued, not in the way Jack did. To her people, trust was often seen as a weakness, a vulnerability that could be exploited. But Jack had shown her something else, that trust could be a strength, something that bound people together, no matter where they came from. "You're not like the others," she said softly, her eyes meeting his once again. "I've seen humans before, but you're different. You don't treat me like an enemy." Jack's smile grew a little wider, and he leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the ground behind him. "I don't see you as an enemy. I see you as someone who needs help, just like anyone else. And honestly, I don't really care where you're from or what your people are like. If you're in trouble, I'll help. That's just who I am." For the first time in what felt like forever, Elira allowed herself to relax. Her muscles, still tense from the crash and the unknown situation, slowly began to loosen. Her breathing became steadier, her mind clearer. There was something about Jack's presence that made her feel calm, something she hadn't felt since before the chaos of the crash. She was used to keeping her emotions in check, used to hiding behind a mask of strength. But with Jack, it was different. She didn't have to pretend to be something she wasn't. Her thoughts turned to her ship, to the wreckage that surrounded them. She had no way of knowing how far from her home planet she was, or even how she had ended up on this world. Everything was a blur, a nightmare she couldn't escape from. But right now, she didn't have to face it alone. Jack was here, and somehow that felt like the first step toward hope. "What happens now?" she asked again, though this time, her voice was steadier. "Do you know how to help me get back home?" Jack looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and determination. "I don't know where you came from, Elira. I don't know how to get you back to your planet, but I'll do whatever it takes to help you. We'll figure it out together." Elira stared at him for a long time, her mind racing. The offer was simple, yet it meant everything. To her, a promise like that had always been something unheard of. And yet, here was Jack, offering exactly that. Help, a chance, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it. The hours passed slowly as Elira and Jack settled into a routine. Jack worked tirelessly, checking on her condition, making sure her wounds were healing properly. Elira, despite her discomfort, found herself relaxing under his care. Her body was healing, but it was the trust that was growing between them that made her feel more alive than she had in days. Jack explained more about his work, how he was part of a team that handled all kinds of rescue missions. His calm, reassuring demeanor made her feel safe. But it wasn't just the way he helped her physically. It was how he treated her, as a person, a fellow being who deserved respect and care. For the first time, Elira felt like she wasn't just an alien. She was someone worth saving. It was then that Elira realized something important. She had never allowed herself to open up to another person, not even to those she considered allies. She had kept her distance from everyone, especially after everything that had happened to her people. But Jack had given her something she hadn't even known she needed: hope and trust. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step to something greater. The days that followed Elira's recovery were filled with moments of quiet peace. Jack had made a temporary shelter for them using materials from the wrecked ship and the surrounding environment. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. They spent their time together in silence, mostly. Jack kept busy with his equipment, and Elira would help when she could, trying to make herself useful while her body regained its strength. During the day, Jack would leave for short trips to explore the area, scouting for supplies, or just checking the communication devices to see if he could contact anyone. But at night, they always returned to their little camp by the wreckage. The stars above were unfamiliar to Elira, a strange reminder that she was far from home. But there was something comforting about the vastness of space. Here on this world, she wasn't alone, not anymore. Elira had started to feel a connection to Jack, one that was different from anything she had ever known. He had saved her life, yes, but it was more than that. He had given her something she hadn't even realized she needed: hope. In the quiet moments, as they shared a meal or sat side by side watching the strange creatures in the forest, Elira would sometimes find herself thinking about the impossible situation they were in. How had she ended up here, so far from her people? How long would she have to wait for someone to come for her? But those thoughts always seemed distant when Jack was around. He was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was still light. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt that way, when things weren't so full of danger and uncertainty. That was until the sky changed. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest. Jack was crouched next to the wreckage, making final adjustments to his equipment when Elira, sitting just outside the camp, noticed something strange. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, but then she saw it again, a dark shape in the sky, moving fast. Her heart began to race. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't a natural creature. It was something else. "Elira," Jack called out, not looking up from his work, but his voice had a sense of urgency. He had noticed too. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes were locked on the object in the sky. The shape was growing larger. It was definitely moving towards them. "Jack," she finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's not a bird. It's something coming towards us." Jack stood up quickly, his face going pale. He knew that look, that instinctive feeling of something not being right. He had seen it before, countless times during rescue missions, when danger was close and all you could do was react. "Stay low," he said sharply. "Get inside the wreckage now." Without waiting for a reply, Jack grabbed his weapon and rushed toward the shelter he had built. Elira didn't question him. Her heart was pounding as she quickly moved to follow his orders. She didn't know what it was, but instinct told her it was bad news. As she crouched behind the wreckage, her thoughts raced. Who could be coming? Her people? The ones who had sent her to this world? No, that didn't make sense. But then who? And why? Her mind was a swirl of possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Jack joined her behind the wreckage, his face grim. "Stay quiet," he whispered, looking at her with an intensity that made her stomach drop. "I need to see what it is." Elira nodded silently, her eyes never leaving the sky. She could see it clearly now, a fleet of ships, large and sleek, descending toward their location. The lead ship was a massive black structure, unlike anything she had seen before. It wasn't like the ships of her people, or even the one she had encountered during her travels. This was something different, something sinister. She didn't recognize the insignia on the side of the ship, but her gut told her it was trouble. "They're not here to help," Elira muttered, her voice barely audible. Jack nodded, his jaw tight. "No, they're not." His grip tightened on his weapon, the same one he had used to treat her injuries. Elira had no idea how capable he was in combat, but she wasn't about to question his resolve. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the readiness in the way he held himself. He wasn't afraid, at least not in a way that would show. But Elira couldn't say the same for herself. Her people were fierce, yes, but this was something different. She didn't know what these enemies wanted, but she knew they weren't coming for peace. The ships hovered over the wreckage, their engines thrumming low and ominous. The air seemed to crackle with energy as the larger ship began to lower toward the ground, the sound of its massive engines drowning out everything else. The ground shook slightly under their feet. Elira could feel the vibrations in her bones. She had no idea who these enemies were, but she could feel their power, and it was overwhelming. Jack motioned for her to stay down as the first ship landed a few dozen meters from their position. The hatch opened, and a figure stepped out, tall, armored, and imposing. Elira's eyes narrowed as she studied the figure. It wasn't human. She couldn't tell what species it was, but there was something about the way it moved that made her think of predatory creatures. This was someone, or something, used to being in control. "Stay quiet," Jack said again, his voice barely a whisper. Elira nodded, though her heart was racing. She wanted to fight, to defend herself, but she knew better than to charge into a battle she wasn't ready for. Jack's warning echoed in her mind. Stay low. This was a battle they couldn't win if they didn't have the upper hand. The figure from the ship began to walk toward the wreckage, flanked by several others, all dressed in dark armor that shimmered under the light. They didn't look like a rescue team. They didn't look like anyone Elira had ever seen before. They were cold, methodical, and their presence felt like a threat in every sense of the word. Jack's grip on his weapon tightened again, his eyes scanning the enemy's movements. He was waiting for the right moment, for something, anything, that could give them an advantage. "We need a plan," Jack said quietly, his breath coming in shallow bursts. Elira took a deep breath. She knew that the time for hiding was running out. Her mind raced, piecing together the fragments of her knowledge about the enemies her people had fought. She didn't know much about them, but she knew one thing. They wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. "I can try to disable their ship," Elira said, her voice low and steady. "I've done it before. I can take out their engines, at least slow them down." Jack looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure?" "I can do it," she said firmly, her eyes locking onto his. There was no hesitation in her voice. She had to do something, anything, to buy them more time. She couldn't let Jack fight alone. Not when he had already risked so much for her. Jack hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, but we need to move quickly." Together, they crept out of their hiding spot, moving carefully toward the wreckage and out of sight. The sound of their enemies' voices grew louder as they approached, their conversation incomprehensible. But Elira could feel the weight of their presence. It was only a matter of time before they noticed her. "We'll have one shot," Jack said quietly, pointing to a small access panel on the ship. "That's where we'll need to hit it." Elira nodded again, her mind focused. There was no turning back now. The enemies were getting closer, and if they didn't act fast, there would be no escape. The enemy was closing in. The sound of their footsteps echoed across the wreckage, and Elira's heart raced in her chest. Jack's eyes were scanning their surroundings, looking for any possible escape route or advantage they could use. The situation was growing more dangerous by the second. Elira had no choice but to act fast. The stakes were higher now than ever before, and she knew that every second counted. "We need to move quickly," Jack whispered, his voice steady despite the tension. "If we wait too long, they'll find us." Elira nodded, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. Her body still wasn't fully healed from her injuries, but she couldn't afford to think about that now. There was a mission ahead of her, and if she didn't act, they would both be trapped. Jack motioned toward the ship that the enemy had landed, its dark hull gleaming in the dim light. The ship looked impenetrable, like a fortress made of metal and technology Lyra couldn't fully understand. But she had seen this kind of ship before. It wasn't just a transport vessel. It was a warship. The insignia on the side was unfamiliar, but the heavy armor and advanced technology told her everything she needed to know. These weren't just regular invaders. They were dangerous. "I'm going to try to disable their engines," Lyra said, her voice calm but firm. She had already made up her mind. She had no choice but to act before they were caught. Her plan was risky, but it was the only chance they had. Jack looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, with a single nod, he stepped aside to let her go. "Be careful," he warned, his voice barely above a whisper, "if something goes wrong." "I know," Lyra interrupted, meeting his gaze. "I'll be fine." She didn't fully believe her own words, but she couldn't afford to doubt herself now. The thought of failing, of letting Jack down, was something she couldn't even entertain. She had to do this. Lyra moved quickly, using the wreckage as cover. Her movements were slow but deliberate, as she knew the enemy was out there, just waiting for someone to make a mistake. The enemy was methodical, searching every inch of the area, their voices harsh and cold as they scoured the wreckage. Their technology was clearly superior, and their patrols were tight. It wouldn't be long before they found her. She focused on the path ahead of her, blocking out everything else. Her mind was clear, sharp. She had been trained for this: stealth, sabotage, and survival. The only thing she had to do was stay calm and trust her instincts. As she approached the warship, she could feel the intense hum of energy coming from it. The ship was powered by a complex system of engines and energy conduits, and if she could target the right spot, she could shut it down. She wasn't sure if it would work, but she had to try. Lyra crouched down beside a pile of debris and took a deep breath, steadying herself. She looked at the control panel of the ship, its lights flickering faintly in the dim light. She had seen similar panels before in her own ship, but this was different. The technology was more advanced, more complex. But that didn't matter. She was here, and she couldn't turn back now. Her fingers danced across the surface of the panel, searching for a weakness, a way in. The warship's defenses were impressive, but they weren't invulnerable. Lyra had learned how to bypass security measures, even the most advanced ones. She just needed to be quick. The enemy was getting closer. She found the access point. It was a small, hidden slot on the side of the panel, just big enough for her to insert a small device she had made from the tools in the wreckage. It was a long shot, but it was her only option. She pressed the device into the slot and held her breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Lyra's heart stopped as she waited, the silence around her unbearable. Had she made a mistake? Was the device faulty? Then, with a soft beep, the panel flickered to life. A series of lights began flashing, signaling that she had successfully hacked into the ship's system. A rush of relief washed over her, but she couldn't relax yet. The hard part was just beginning. She quickly accessed the ship's engine controls, her fingers flying across the interface. The system was more complicated than she had anticipated, but she refused to let panic set in. Every second was crucial. The enemy would notice something was wrong soon. As she continued working, her mind raced with possibilities. What if the ship had built-in safeguards against this kind of attack? What if the enemy had detected her already and were planning an ambush? She couldn't let fear take over. She had to focus, stay calm, and complete the mission. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Lyra found the main power conduit that connected to the engines. She knew this was her chance. With a quick flick of her wrist, she initiated the shutdown sequence. The lights on the panel blinked, and then the entire system went dark. For a moment, Elira stood frozen, her ears ringing with the silence. Had it worked? Had she done it? Then she heard it, the hum of the engines slowly dying down. She let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The ship was powerless now. It wouldn't be able to take off or chase them. They had bought themselves some time. But Elira knew that wasn't enough. The enemy would figure out what had happened soon. They would send backup, and it wouldn't be long before they came looking for her. Her heart pounded as she turned to head back to Jack. But just as she was about to move, a voice cut through the air. Found her. Elira's blood ran cold. She whipped around to see one of the enemy soldiers standing at the entrance to the wreckage, his weapon aimed straight at her. Her mind raced. They found me. For a moment, she considered running, but the soldier had already raised his weapon, and she knew there was nowhere to go. Jack was too far away to help her now. She had made a dangerous decision, and it had come back to haunt her. But then something unexpected happened. The soldier didn't shoot. Instead, he paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked past her. Elira followed his gaze and saw Jack stepping out from behind the wreckage, his weapon raised. The soldier's eyes flickered to the ship and back to Elira, and then he made a strange gesture. Elira didn't understand what it meant, but she didn't have time to think about it. She knew that if she didn't act fast, they were both going to be caught. Now, Jack shouted, and Elira didn't hesitate. She dove to the ground, rolling to the side as Jack fired a shot. The blast hit the soldier square in the chest, and he collapsed to the ground. But there were more, much more. Elira scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. She had no idea how many of them there were, but she knew that they couldn't stay here for long. The ship was useless now, but the soldiers were still a deadly threat. "We have to go," Jack said urgently, grabbing her arm. "Move." Elira didn't argue. She ran, her legs aching from the strain, her body still not fully recovered from her injuries. But she couldn't slow down. Not now. Not when they were so close to survival. They darted behind the wreckage, trying to find cover as the enemy soldiers scrambled to regroup. The world seemed to slow down around them. As they took cover, their breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "We can't stay here," Jack said. "There's a clearing up ahead. We'll make a stand there." Elira didn't reply. She just nodded, trusting Jack as they made their way toward the clearing. Every step was a risk, every movement a dangerous gamble. But Elira was determined. She had made a decision, a dangerous one, and now she had to see it through. For both their sakes. Elira's heart was still pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she and Jack made their way through the dense forest. The clearing ahead was just a few hundred meters away, but every step felt like an eternity. They had barely escaped the enemy soldiers, but Elira knew it was only a matter of time before they regrouped and came after them. The enemy was relentless. Jack glanced over at Elira, his face grim but focused. "We need to keep moving," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough urgency to make her push herself harder. "They'll be on our trail soon." Elira nodded without saying anything. She knew Jack was right. She had seen how quickly the enemy had responded when they attacked the soldier. They weren't going to give up so easily. As they approached the clearing, Elira's mind raced. What now? The enemy warship had been disabled, but that didn't mean they were safe. Their ship was still somewhere in the wreckage, but it wasn't an option to go back to it now. They needed to get to a safe place, somewhere they could regroup and figure out what their next move would be. A loud crack in the distance snapped Elira out of her thoughts, and she instinctively dropped into a crouch, her eyes darting around the clearing. She could hear footsteps now, but they didn't sound like the enemy. They were heavier, like the footsteps of something much larger, something more dangerous. "Elira, look," Jack whispered, pointing toward the edge of the clearing.